Readers of Reddit, what's the dumbest thing you've had to explain to a client? Story 1. I watched a Florida Supreme Court appeal over a murder case. The guy killed several people with a baseball bat and wanted his sentence mitigated because he had PTSD. He claimed he had PTSD from experiencing the murder he committed. The court had to explain to him that a mental issue acquired while committing a crime cannot mitigate the crime you committed. Story 2. I once had to explain to a client that he could, in fact, fire an employee for 1, stealing significant sums of money from the safe, 2, pulling a gun on a coworker who questioned these activities, and 3, waving said gun in a customer's face moments later, all of which are on camera. Story 3. In my state, we have this thing called victims' compensation. An oversimplification of how it works goes as follows. If you're the victim of a crime and suffer some form of injury, e.g. psychological, physical, etc., you can apply for a payment from state funds. If you're the perpetrator of one of those crimes, e.g. an assault, robbery, pedophilia, etc., an order can be made for you to pay the state back an amount relating to that victim's compensation. I had a client who felt the process of being convicted for assaulting his relatives and having to pay victims' compensation back to the state was arduous. And in return, he should be receiving victims' compensation from the state. So that was fun to explain. Edit explanation was you're not the victim in that. Story 4. I once had to explain what a maiden name was. They had no idea. Similarly, with a different client, I tried to explain why they needed to fill out the intake questionnaire. I was explaining that I need information such as their name, address, and date of birth in order to draft paperwork. Their response: why do I have to do this? What did I even hire you for? You're useless. If I have to do all this work, I might as well represent myself. They were super pissed and stomped out the front door. Sorry, I don't magically know your date of birth. Edit. As for the maiden name, it was a very small country town. This person was most definitely a native English speaker. As for the questionnaire, someone asked why we don't just ask for a driver's license. The questionnaire was about 2 or 3 pages long and also needed other information such as any previous names, social security number, children's names, etc. Story 5. Bankruptcy attorney here. If you know you're coming to my office to file bankruptcy, do not make major financial decisions before you talk to me, e.g., cashing out your 401k, paying your family members the money you owe them, buying a car with no intention of paying off the loan, etc. The court allows you to discharge your debt, and the only thing they ask is for you to be honest and not sneaky about it. You got to respect the process. Edit. I'm getting a lot of questions about personal situations, but I'm not here to provide legal advice. If you're considering bankruptcy, speak to an attorney sooner than later. Most will provide a free consultation, and the longer you wait, the more problematic your situation may become. Story 6 represented a client charged with statutory rape who had a large number of explanations for the various evidence in his case that I had to explain would not be a good idea to testify to or argue to the jury. The KY jelly you purchased with the kid at Walmart was not for applying to an undiagnosed skin condition on your chest. The hundreds of pages of internet chat logs prior to traveling hundreds of miles to meet the kid, consisting of repeated explicit overtures, emotional manipulation, lies about your age and wealth, and specific plans for how you would remove him from his parents' home were not meaningless banter. The fact that you had an active prescription for Viagra does not mean you are. The semen matching your DNA did not find its way into the rectum of the 13-year-old boy because of your medical condition that results in leakage and the fact that when you are staying in a hotel room, you do not lift the toilet seat when you urinate, which must have resulted in the material being deposited on the seat and transferred to the boy when he sat on the seat. You are not the victim taken advantage of by the hypersexual teenager for whom you were merely trying to provide innocent emotional support. I had to explain all of these things and others many times. I'm not sure he ever actually believed any of them. Story 7. That they had to pay me. This is more common than you'd think. For some reason, some people think lawyers are like their personal spiritual guides or fairy godmother. Story 8. When I was a legal intern at a criminal defender's law office, we had a client who was charged with murder. We explained to the client not to make any phone call saying anything incriminating because it will be recorded. Where prisoners can use the phone, there's a giant sign that says phone calls will be recorded. On top of that, before you're able to call, there is an automated recording that tells you that all calls are being recorded and monitored unless it is to your attorney, which are covered by privilege. Client made a call to his girlfriend that evening asking her to hide the gun. Edit. Just found out what happened to the case. Apparently it was dismissed. The defense attorney was really good. Edit 2, because I think my previous edit infuriated a lot of people. Yeah, it sucks that a lot of criminals tend to get out on some BS technicalities, but a good criminal defense attorney will make sure that a prosecutor does their job properly too, and the case won't go up on appeal and get reversed on some other error. Also, I was just a lowly intern at the time, Stop sending me hate mail. Story 9, a lawyer can't out and out lie. You said to them, yeah, I burned his house down and pissed on the ashes. He can't say you were 2 states away. That blew some of my students' heads. Story 10, I recently had a call from a guy who found out that Long John Silver's was microwaving his baked shrimp combo. He wanted to eat there for every meal for a year and then sue them for false advertising. He changed his mind when I suggested that he would probably die of a heart attack before reaching his 1-year goal. Story 11, that your boss sending you to a drug test after he walked in on you snorting cocaine off your desk does not qualify as entrapment. You cannot sue him. Story 12, well, from the other side. I once missed a court date and assumed that had put me in even deeper legal trouble. My lawyer then had to explain to me that dodging his calls to avoid being arrested was just dumb and the exact wrong course of action. Story 13, don't signal to the judge you need to use the restroom during your trial by making eye contact and vigorously nodding while urgently pointing at your crotch. Story 14, it doesn't matter if you were sober or not. You jumped out a 3rd-story window with a beer bottle and threw it at a cop. The jury is going to think you were drunk. Also, I think you were drunk. Story 15L, Scott Briscoe's free legal advice is hilarious and absolutely worth a read. Edit part 2 here. Story 16, when a client called me this past Memorial Day, and I asked why she was calling me on a holiday, she replied that she didn't think Jews celebrated Memorial Day. Never thought that I would have to explain that to anyone. Edit to answer some of the questions. Yes, I am Jewish. No, I never told her I was Jewish. I have an answering service which took her call and emailed me the message, which was that it was very urgent that she speak with me that day, given that the courts were closed and her case was a paternity and child support matter. I thought it had to be quite the emergency. It was not. She just wanted to ask whether the suspected father was required to take the DNA test ordered by the court. I then had to explain what paternity meant. Story 17, that the presence of yellow fringe on the flags in the courtroom do not mean that the court is an admiralty court without jurisdiction to hear the client's criminal case. Sovereign citizens are something else. Story 18, I once had to explain to opposing counsel that his entire argument was wrong because he had cited a statute for chattels not real property. It was a case involving a land contract. I used to be a legal aid lawyer, so sometimes I had sovereign citizens come in for help. I'd have to explain that their magic words wouldn't solve anything and they were going to get evicted. If they wouldn't agree to negotiate for settlement, I wouldn't represent them because they never had any real defenses and we didn't have the resources to litigate impossible cases. Edit, I get it. I said statute instead of statute. I'm useless on mobile and without my clerk, so this was a perfect storm. Also, I don't litigate anymore, so I'm fortunately done with sovereign citizens. Story 19, I was contacted by a couple who had paid for a trip to see the midnight sun in northern Norway. They wanted to sue the travel agency when they found out it was the same sun as always. I had to explain that there's only a single sun and that they can't sue a travel agency for selling a midnight sun trip. Story 20, not the lawyer. In the other side of the lawsuit for this piece of work, obviously I'm trying not to reveal details, sorry, but it's still going on. So far, the judge, his lawyer, I want to say it's been 9 different lawyers now, etc., have had to explain to him statute of limitations. Lawyers quit if you don't pay them. My lawyer cannot advise him. He has to pay the court fees. Lawyers quit if you don't pay them. If you fire your lawyer when suing as a corporation, you will be kicked out. Lawyers quit if you don't pay them. Statute of limitations. My lawyer cannot advise him. That during discovery, he handed over emails that had the actual date of a meeting instead of the month earlier. He was claiming lawyers quit if you don't pay them. Statute of limitations. Yes, the judge can go off the record and berate you for 15 minutes if she thinks it helps the case. My lawyer will laugh in his face for asking for advice about the judge. His lawyer needs his actual address, not just a FedEx store where he picks up his mail periodically. The court isn't going to bother calling each of 8 different cell numbers that just might be the one you currently have active. Lawyers quit if you don't pay them. My lawyer cannot advise him. The reading of the settlement and agreeing to it on record in court is binding. Simply saying that a person is the attorney doesn't actually make them the attorney. There's actual paperwork. My lawyer cannot advise him. Lawyers quit if you don't pay them. The ruling was against him, and he can't sell what was never his. He needs to actually pay the court fees for his appeal. He needs an attorney for the appeal, because corporations must be represented by an attorney in court. He needs to file the paperwork required for an appeal. He still needs an attorney for the appeal, because corporations still have to be represented by an attorney in court. My lawyer cannot advise him. Yes, Rule 8, 141 really does mean you're about to be kicked out permanently. By October 28th, he needs to have an attorney and pay the court fees and file his paperwork, or his appeal goes away. And lastly, just because I feel like it needs another one lawyers quit is you don't pay them. simply because that's how he went through so many of them. Edit almost forgot my lawyer cannot give him any advice. Story 21. I had a client once who was in trouble for stealing sample medication from a hospital. We got security footage from the DA as part of the evidence, and when it came down, we watched it together. The camera was literally 10 feet away in a well-lit room, and we watched her shovel prescription samples into a garbage bag and walk off. After it was done, she turned to me and asked if I thought she was going to be able to get off. I said no. Story 22. I once had a client who wanted to declare bankruptcy. I explained he needed to have his tax returns for the past few years filed in order to do so. He said he hadn't filed taxes in 20 years because it ain't none of the government's business how much money I make. Story 23. I annul. But my ex-husband's lawyer had to explain to him that hearsay doesn't mean someone heard him say it. My ex was arrested for felony domestic battery against me after he called 911 and threatened to kill me. He thought his threats were inadmissible because someone heard him say them, ergo, hearsay. Story 24. No. You dingus. Self-defense does not mean he punches you in the face and then 2 weeks later you go to his house, ring his doorbell, and kick the out of him. Story 25. I work on appeals, which means I spend more time with the law than with real people. But the law has some gems like this dude who really happened at the police station. The arresting officer advised defendant, both orally and with a consent form, of his constitutional rights pursuant to Miranda v. Arizona, 384 U.S. for 3686 S.C.T. 1602, 16L, ed. 2D694, 1966. Defendant refused to sign the consent form and stated that he would never waive his rights. At the same time, however, he asked the arresting officer whether he could speak to him man-to-man. At this point, a detective with the task force entered the room with the evidence of the drugs gathered from the inventory search of the Corvette and advised defendant of the charges that would be filed against him. To this, defendant responded, "You think this is big time? This ain't." The detective then asked defendant whether he was willing to provide them any information, and defendant responded that if he were released with his drugs in his possession that night, he would call the police occasionally with information on certain persons he felt needed to be off the streets. The detective then started to leave the booking area, and defendant said, "And I want my back." When the detective asked him whether he was referring to the drugs discovered in the Corvette, defendant responded that he was, "File that under, you should definitely exercise that right to remain silent." Story 26. Not a lawyer, but processed a case where a woman sued her lawyers after a divorce because they didn't explain to her that divorcing her husband meant she'd no longer be married. Story 27 from this week client. So, I don't smoke meth. I think it's from unprotected me. So you would like me to explain to the judge it's okay. You just bang meth head's client, yeah? Story 28. I had a mediation last week with a client on a really crappy case and managed to settle for a decent amount. I then explained to the plaintiff her share of the settlement after paying the bill. She was confused, so I explained that I was speaking about our fee and expenses. She got upset because we were taking her money. I had to explain what a contingency contract was and how we were compensated for our services. The conversation took a turn for the absurd when I had to explain I did not work for free. Story 29. Oh God. Can I please post this here? If not, let me know, and he'll just edit in a smiley face or something. So, while all the true professionals here will spot this without my disclaimer, most of the folks reading this are just dabblers and Redditors abroad. I am not an attorney in any way. So, I had a property in Buffalo, New York, bought it at 23, lived for a bit, then moved elsewhere and rented said property. My final tenant was a classic shitstorm of stupid. She derped on the rent. I offered payment arrangement. Derped on the arrangement. I sent notice to pay or quit. Paid. Derped again. Sent notice. Was told she'd been in an accident and lost her job. A certain acquaintance let me know she did in fact have a job of lots of top-notch skip tracers in Buffalo BTW. Literally explained to her on the phone, by letter, and by email that she had enough income to pay the rent and utilities and eat food, acquiesced, paid half, new payment arrangement, kept up for a whole month, then completely crapped out. At this point, living out of state and looking at property values, I was ready to sell, struck a deal whereby tenant could have 2 free months rent if she signed an early term on lease, got that. Sold house within 3 weeks. Meanwhile, I served demand for rent, then filed for eviction, court date set, still no payments. The tenant proceeds to inform me in no uncertain terms they're not paying. Night before eviction court texts, and lets me know her son is in the hospital, and she can't make it. I told her explicitly that if that was true, she should let the court know and I'd gaff. Does not show to court. Gets settled against for over $3,000. Don't trip over my stupidity. Please plus warrant. Proceeds to send lots of angry texts. The day of eviction, she bails on the property, thank God though, really, and steals all of the appliances. I learn of this at 2 p.m. I text her at 2:10 p.m., and let her know if she returns the items undamaged within 30 minutes. No harm, no foul. If not, I called the police and filed charges. Ended up filing charges, is now wanted FO arrest for grand larceny and gaff. She completely think her actions are legit. I waffle between self-shaming for being affable and being baffled, and being angry and being thoroughly entertained. Story 30, not a lawyer, but a friend of my dad once tried to sue him. Why? Because his dad to friends had died, and since my dad was like a father to his friend, he should give him money every month just like his dad did when he was alive. Apparently the lawyer just said that's not how it works. Story 31, not to a client, but other party. I was acting for a particular manufacturer. They were sued for an injury incurred by someone using a product made by a different manufacturer. I rang their lawyer and said I was acting for A, and I didn't understand why A had been named as defendant in the suit, but the body of the claim said the plaintiff had been injured by a product made by B. I asked if it was a monster typo, or what. The response was that they thought it was the manufacturer of product sold under the name B. Now, that isn't inherently stupid, I guess so. I said that had no basis in fact whatsoever, and that A and B were unrelated competitors, and asked as a matter of curiosity how they had reached the conclusion that A were the manufacturer of B. The response was along the lines of someone in the office. I think it was maybe Jim, one of our clerks, who thought had read somewhere that B were made by That was it. No checking of the product paperwork, no company searches, no brand name register searches, no inquiries with our client or B, not even an F in Google. Just some guy in the office had once heard, and on that basis they issued a very financially sizable product liability suit. Story 32, probate attorney. Having to explain to people not to take property that was bequeathed to someone else. Funny how the decedent promised the car to 4 people, but willed it to a 5th. In my state, there are mandatory treble damages for conversion against an estate, so that $20,000 car you wanted turns into a $60,000 penalty. Let the PR or trustees distribute according to the will or trust, then attempt to get property you think belongs to you. Don't just take it. Happens a lot. Story 33, filled in as a receptionist at my dad's firm many moons ago. Dumb son of a long-standing client called in a panic. He'd gotten drunk and gotten married in Las Vegas to his long-term GF and baby mama. He said, but it's fine, Rami, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, so if I never go back, I am good. I finally figured out that he took it literally and thought that he was only married while in Clark County. I had to explain that, no, he was married in all 50 states. He started yelling that he wanted to do over, so of course I was the catchphrase for the rest of the summer. Additional info, since it wasn't germane to the Q being asked, I didn't include it, but now, the rest of the story while I was explaining that he was indeed married another SEC. Past a note is that Rick X. I nodded and she said, give me the phone. She had gone online and found pictures of the joyous event. Rick, log on to MySpace right now and delete all of those photos immediately. And for the love of God, make your page private. Brief silence. Why? Because you're on probation. The judge will revoke it and send you to jail. You aren't allowed to leave the state, let alone be drinking and partying. Yes, later, on the advice of counsel, he stayed married rather than appear before a judge and admit that he had violated the terms of his probation. Idiot. Story 34. That it was not fiscally responsible to convert that 6-figure settlement check immediately and to instead put it into some sort of savings account or something similar for the benefit of your kids. Received call from bank 20 minutes later asking if it was okay to turn into 100s. Story 35. I went on a date with a lawyer recently who told me he had to be at work at 9 a.m. the next day to explain to someone that he could, in fact, be fired for killing someone with a company vehicle. Story 36. By far and away the strangest thing I have ever had to explain to a client is how to use an elevator. Our courtroom was on the 4th floor, and she needed to take an elevator to get there. I had to describe how you get in, push the 4, and then get out when the lights above show she's on floor 4. The dumbest legal thing I've had to explain is that you can't terminate your parental rights voluntarily and then request visitation with that child. Story 37. Late to the party. But I'm a law student and I clerk at a big firm. I was in a partner's office when she took a phone call in which she had to explain to a potential client that, yes, he did have to pay her if he wanted her to do the several hours of research that his question required. He was baffled as to why she couldn't spend a few hours looking it up and then get back to him with the information for free. Story 38. I am a lawyer, and I mostly don't touch this on Reddit anymore, because teenagers and drunks want to argue with no basis to do so. Fun to read, though. Story 39. A guy called up. He had 5 children with 5 different women, and woman 5 was suing him for support. This would change his withholding from work 77 instead of 62. He was also jobless and let out of jail for felonious non-payment of child support on woman 2. The best job a felon can hope for is like 10 an hour, capping his pre-tax earning potential around $2.33 an hour if he can get hired as a felon. This was especially troubling, as he had no way to support his new girlfriend, who was pregnant. He asked me, "What can I do?" "I don't know. Stop women without protection would be a start." Not a lawyer, but my ex had to have something explained to him. He was jobless, did drugs, had no money, no vehicle, etc. Kicked me out of my house with a knife. Decided he was going to get custody of our 7-year-old son. I lawyered up, and my lawyer told me that his lawyer will straighten him out. He doesn't have to. My ex told me after that his lawyer basically told him to off. Unemployed, homeless daddies don't get custody. Never mind take a kid away from home owning, hardworking, addiction-free, school bus driving mother. She told him based on his previous tax return that he owed me $623 a month, and he would be lucky to get 1 weekend a month with our son. By the way, he quickly dropped the idea when he saw there was no payoff, and my son hasn't seen him in a year. TLDR, homeless unemployed drug addict try to get custody of her son. Story 40, I saw a guy yell at his attorney that he wasn't coerced into a confession when the lawyer said that's what it looked like to him. Lawyer had to explain that it was a good thing. Not sure why the guy was mad when he didn't know what it means. I guess it just sounded bad, I'd know. Story 41, hypothetically, before going into a negotiation for a divorce separation agreement, I sat down with my client. We set clear, specific goals for vitiation, spousal support, etc. In the negotiations, I exceeded every goal. We got more money than she told me she would be willing to settle for, more visitation custody, and every one of the little particulars she wanted in the way of personal and real property. Total victory. Conceded to buy the opposite party. A few days later, she hypothetically called me up and said, "He's such an... let's him up some more." I want to drag this through the courts. It took a while, but I finally explained to her that we had already won. It was time to move on, and going against our signed agreement now would probably result in a less favorable outcome to her than what we had already achieved. Story 42, I have to explain to clients on a daily basis that yes, you do have to actually pay for that house you are buying. If your mortgage company hasn't given us the money yet, or you didn't arrange for them to give enough money, then you cannot pay for house, and house is not yours. And no, I cannot give you keys to house before it is yours. Story 43, not a client per se, but a victim. How to explain what the word ejaculate meant. Defense attorney asked if the defendant ejaculated, and she said no. On redirect, I explained that the word meant something came out of his penis, and she said, "Oh, then yes, not the brightest person I've ever met." Story 44, not a client, but an opposing party who claimed that she wouldn't spay her aggressive female pit bull because she was Catholic and didn't believe in birth control. Story 45, I had a defendant, and I reassured him. I was like, "Hey, buddy, look, I know a lot about the law and various other lay warnings, and well-educated and well-versed." I told him that this situation real estate-wise is very complex, and then he had the gall to ask me where I went to law school, so of course I just pleaded the fifth. Then I challenged him to go toe-to-toe with me on law to see who comes out the victor. A client in a discrimination case was seeking reinstatement in his school. He was wrongfully expelled. He didn't want money or any type of compensation. He just wanted to be able to attend classes again. When I told him that the case would require a small retainer, $2,500 plus appearance fees, he said no, they'll pay you on contingency. I then told him that he wasn't suing for money. He was suing for reinstatement. There was no monetary award for his action, so my contingent fee would be 1/3 of zero. He then told me no. I mean, it'll pay you your fee contingent on you winning. I told him that there were dozens of man-hours involved in bringing his case to court. It isn't fair to pay me based on an outcome that had nothing to do with my hard work. His response, "Well, you better win then." It's at this point that I texted my secretary with an SOS. 2 minutes later, she came in like a winged angel and said, "The consumer, your brother is on the phone from jail." That quickly ended the madness of no paying. Tough luck, Chuck. Another 1A client came in and said someone has been robbing my checks for 15 years. He then showed me his paperwork. When I say paperwork, I mean crinkled, folded, balled up, garbage that I needed to decipher. When I got his checks pay stubs, I said, "You have checks, you get paid. No one is robbing you." He bluntly said someone named Stu is taking money out of my checks. I want to sue him, Stu. I look deeper and see nothing about he is talking about. Then, on one pay stub, I see deduction, SU. It dawned on me immediately. I said, "That's not Stu. It's an abbreviation for Support Collection Unit. They take money for child support." He looked at me blankly and said, "Child support? I ain't got a child again." As I started to ask my next question, he said I had a child, but that was a long time ago. Like 10 years. I said, "You have a 10-year-old child?" "Yes, in New York. You have to pay for them until they're out of college." 22 years. He was flabbergasted, more so because he couldn't sue Stu than anything else. Story 46, this guy was trying to get divorced and went and had the Attorney General's office begin a CPCR suit affecting the parent-child relationship. He then found out the AG wouldn't finish the SAPCR without the divorce having been finalized. So he comes into the office wanting to non-suit his divorce so that he can get a SAPCR processed. I had to ask him in 5 different ways, do you want to remain married to your wife? Yes or no. He finally gave me a we're not really married anyways. It was just common law. That's called marriage in this state. So please answer yes or no, I guess so. I didn't process the non-suit, but I told him where he can find forms to do it on his own. Story 47, my mother claimed that she was abused when she hired her lawyer after my father started divorce proceedings, after the first court date. He had to explain to her that in order to claim abuse, you have to actually be abused. She just thought that if she said it, everyone would take her word for it. Story 48, late to the party, a pimp was on trial in federal court for trafficking and was being cross-examined about allegedly beating a prostitute. Her responded, I didn't beat her that hard. I just hit her like you would a puppy. His defense to beating a hooker was that he also beats puppies. Story 49, not the dumbest, but the one I have the most problem with is attorney-client privilege. It's only a secret and safe from discovery from the other side. If you keep a secret, don't forward my emails to other people. Don't talk about your case. Keep it a secret. Story 50, context. I used to be a lawyer in a small country town. The stories I have, I once had to explain to an elderly gentleman that an argument didn't allow him to stab his neighbor in the chest, but he was shouting at me. I wanted him to stop. To be clear, it wasn't self-defense. He referred to it as poking, as in, he wouldn't shut up, so I poked him a little bit. That story has an epilogue. After he was sentenced, he was picked up from the courthouse by the victim. They proceeded to go to a pub and get hammered, still best of friends. I had to explain to a client that an argument over marijuana, which is illegal here, isn't grounds for him to beat the ever-living out of his neighbor. That same client was quite happy to plead guilty to assault cause harm, but refused to plead guilty to aggravated assault, exactly the same penalty. I had a young Aboriginal client who was on bail for some fairly trivial offenses. He breached his bail about 10 times. I had to explain to him that the court wouldn't believe him when he said he would turn up to court next time, because he hadn't turned up to court the last 3 times. As far as I know, he is still in jail. I had to explain to a bloke that he wouldn't get custody of his children after he had been charged with domestic violence offenses against the mother. His justification for wanting full custody, but the mother isn't fit to be a mom. She stayed with me. I've had to explain to a very large number of men why quitting their jobs so they didn't have to pay child support was a very bad idea. TLDR, people are stupid. Edit to respond to a few comments. In South Australia, your child support is based on your income, but you can make an application to have the other party's income assessed, and in certain circumstances have a deemed income. For example, if you can show that a trad-I's income is much higher than their taxable income, such as by showing that their lifestyle doesn't reflect their declared income. You can also have a deemed income assessment where a person is voluntarily unemployed, but evidence is necessary. Story 51 from friend. Try explaining to a single mother that just because she and her son have the same last name, that does not make them brother and sister. Story 52, probably too late to the party for anyone to see this, but explaining to my client's customer why my client cannot sign a general NDA, because my client's job was to provide reports to other parties. Story 53, one time we had a family in with a huge dispute over transferring possession of a lease. The mother and youngest daughter were cursing me off and threatening to sue because the father's signature on the new lease was forged the entire time the dad was in the background, apologizing to me and explaining that it was his real signature. They saw him sign originally. We printed out new copies and let them watch him sign it again, so they would finally leave. Story 54, not an issue of explaining something, but a very dumb client. I had a client who had lost his job and house side left him. He had a breakdown and went out speeding on his Ducati, gets pulled over and refuses to remove his helmet, ends up in a wrestling match with the cops, and is arrested and charged with everything you can imagine. Using his circumstances as mitigating factors, I get him an amazing deal that shocked the out of me, essentially a small fine. Right after the gavel lands, this gives the arresting officer the finger and mouths you to him. Judge sees it and holds him in contempt and threatens to revoke the plea deal, which he can't do. Ultimately added in a psych eval and some probation to that fine. Story 55, not a lawyer, but I used to work for them. We had one lawyer who was really sweet and kind and soft-spoken, never got mad about anything. One day I'm walking by her office, and I hear talking to who is clearly a lawyer on the other side of one of our cases. We can't do that because it's subject to privilege. Voice rising, but that's not how this works. Voice rising again, no. I already told you we aren't going to do that yelling now, because it's privileged, and no lawyer would ever give up that privilege. I would be disbarred for that. Also was sued once for non-payment and libel. We hired a contractor to do some work. We didn't pay and wrote a bad review. He sued. In a statement of claim, He cited several bad reviews that were written on a review site by one of our employees, John Doe. So things go along, and we end up at the pretrial case management hearing. His lawyer lays out his case to us, and the administrative judge overseeing it. We listen politely, and when he's done, inform him that John Doe does not actually work for our company, that the reviews he cited in his claim were written by someone we don't know and have absolutely no affiliation with. Our bad review was written by John Smith, which was not included in his claim. His response, well, that's for a court to determine. No, you claimed we wrote reviews we didn't. The reviews you cite clearly list the address, and it's not ours. These reviews are not from us and are central to your claim, so you have no claim. Well, that's for a court to decide.